the psychology shadow, where the hidden parts of your mind come into the light. What you're about to hear might change the way you see yourself and everyone around you.
There's something happening in your mind right now that you're not fully aware of. And it's been shaping your choices, your reactions, and the people you're drawn to probably for most of your life. Think about the last time you walked into a room full of people and felt yourself shift. Not dramatically, not consciously, just a small internal adjustment. The way you held your shoulders, the version of your laugh you chose, the opinions you kept to yourself. It happens so quickly you almost don't notice it. One moment you're alone, entirely yourself, and then the door opens and something changes. A different version of you steps forward, competent, agreeable, appropriate, likable. We all do this, every single one of us. And for most of our lives, we do it so automatically that we barely register it's happening at all. But Carl Jung had a name for this. And more importantly, he had a theory about what it costs us. Because the parts of yourself that stay outside the room, they don't disappear, they wait. And over time, the distance between who you show the world and who you actually are can become one of the most significant sources of unease in a person's life, without them ever being able to name exactly why. You know how to be professional, how to be the version of yourself that shows up at work. Measured, capable, appropriate. You know which jokes land in that context and which ones don't. You've learned, probably without anyone explicitly teaching you, exactly how much of yourself is welcome in that room. And then you go home, or you call an old friend, or you spend an evening alone. And something relaxes, something you didn't even realize was held tightly starts to release. You talk differently, you move differently. You allow yourself opinions and moods and expressions that you wouldn't have reached for an hour earlier. Most people experience this as completely normal, which it is. But if you sit with it for a moment, really sit with it, something slightly more interesting emerges. Who was that person at work, and who is this person now, and which one is actually you? The question sounds simple, it isn't. Think about how differently you present yourself depending on who's in the room. With your parents, perhaps there's a version of you that's slightly more careful, that edits certain things. That reverts almost against your will to older patterns, the child you used to be, the role you used to play in that family system. Think about the times you've laughed at something that didn't actually strike you as funny, because the social pressure to laugh was easier than the alternative. The times you've agreed with someone not because you genuinely agreed, but because disagreeing felt like too much. There's a specific feeling that comes with these moments. It's not shame exactly. It's more like a faint internal dissonance, a small gap between what's happening on the surface and what's happening underneath. Most of the time we move past it quickly, we file it away, we get on with the day. But sometimes at the end of a long stretch of performing, a week of meetings, a family holiday, an extended period of being exactly who everyone around you needs you to be, you'll notice something that's harder to ignore, a kind of exhaustion that sleep doesn't fully fix. A flatness, a sense that you've been somewhere very busy, doing something very demanding, and that the demanding thing was somehow being yourself. That feeling has a name, and understanding where it comes from changes how you relate to it. Here's the question the psychology will answer. If the version of yourself you show the world isn't the whole of who you are, then where does the rest of you go? Carl Jung spent a significant portion of his life thinking about exactly this question. He gave the concept we're exploring today a name, the persona. The word itself is significant. In ancient Greek theater, persona referred to the mask worn by an actor. The literal physical object placed over the face to indicate character, to signal to the audience who this person was playing. Jung borrowed the term deliberately, because what he observed was that human beings develop social masks with exactly this function. We create a face for the world, a presentation, a carefully constructed version of ourselves designed to navigate social reality successfully. And here's the important thing, Jung didn't think this was pathological. He didn't think the persona was a sign of weakness or dishonesty. He thought it was entirely necessary. The persona is the part of the psyche that makes social life possible. It's the interface between your inner world and the outer world's demands. Think of it like this, the persona is a diplomatic layer. It's the ambassador your inner world sends out to meet the world's expectations. The problem Jung identified was not the persona itself. The problem was a specific kind of confusion. What he called identification with the persona. This is when the ambassador forgets they're an ambassador. When the diplomatic layer stops being a tool the self uses and starts being what the self believes itself to be. In other words, when you forget that the mask is a mask. This happens gradually and almost invisibly. You spend years developing a particular presentation of yourself. The responsible one, the funny one, the capable one, the agreeable one, and that presentation is rewarded. It works. And over time, the gap between the performance and the performer starts to close, not because you've become more authentic, but because you've stopped noticing the gap at all. Jung proposed that this identification carried a specific cost. Because everything that doesn't fit the persona, every quality, every impulse, every feeling that contradicts the image you've constructed, has to go somewhere. It doesn't evaporate, it gets pushed inward, pushed down, into what Jung called the shadow. The shadow is, in the simplest possible terms, the part of yourself you've decided you're not. The qualities you couldn't integrate into the face you show the world. If your persona is the responsible, serious professional, the shadow might contain your capacity for recklessness, for play, for rage. The shadow doesn't disappear when you ignore it, it grows. And this is where things become genuinely interesting. Because the stronger and more rigid the persona, the more tightly you grip the image of who you're supposed to be, the more pressure builds in the shadow. And that pressure has to go somewhere. Sometimes it emerges in dreams. Sometimes in the disproportionate reaction you have to a stranger who seems to be doing something you'd never allow yourself to do. Sometimes in the exhaustion we talked about earlier, that bone-deep flatness that comes from too long spent being your own ambassador. Jung observed that people who were very strongly identified with their persona were often the most disconnected from themselves. The most alone in a particular way, because if everyone around you is responding to the ambassador, then who exactly is being known? Who is being seen? There's a particular loneliness that comes with performing yourself very well. It's the loneliness of being in a room full of people who like you and knowing somewhere quietly that what they like isn't quite the whole of you. Jung believed that psychological health wasn't about destroying the persona. Psychological health, in his view, involved what he called a permeable persona, a mask you wear consciously, when you can put on and take off. The difference between someone who wears their persona consciously and someone who's identified with it is subtle but profound. The person who wears it consciously can feel the shift when they put it on. They know which parts of themselves they're leaving at the door. And they know this is the crucial part, that those parts are still there, waiting. They haven't been abandoned or disowned, just temporarily set aside. That awareness, the simple awareness that the mask is a mask, is, in Jungian terms, already a form of individuation. When you understand this, when the concept of the persona stops being abstract and starts mapping onto your own experience, something interesting happens. You start to catch yourself in the act. Not with judgment, not with the pressure to immediately stop performing and become radically authentic. Just with a quiet noticing, oh, there it is, I just shifted, I just selected. That noticing is not a small thing. Most people go decades without it. When you start to notice the mask, you also start to notice what's behind it, not with alarm, with curiosity. You might notice, for example, that the emotions you tend to suppress in public don't actually diminish when suppressed. They compact, they become denser. And then they surface somewhere else in some other form, often at a time or in a way you didn't choose. The anger that comes out sideways, the tears that arrive at the wrong moment. Understanding the persona helps you see these eruptions differently, not as failures of self-control, but as the shadow making itself known, as the parts of you that have been waiting patiently for an opening. You start to understand, too, the particular dynamic that plays out in close relationships, when someone who loves you tells you something about yourself that you immediately, instinctively want to reject. That flash of defensiveness is, very often, a persona response, the mask protecting itself. Because here's what the persona is fundamentally doing. It's managing other people's perceptions of you. When someone offers a perception that wasn't in the script, the system flags it as a threat, not because the observation is necessarily wrong, sometimes precisely because it isn't. When you start to notice this pattern, the automatic rejection of information that doesn't fit the self-image, you gain something. You gain the ability to pause before the rejection, to ask, is this actually wrong, or does it just not fit the story I've been telling? That pause is where growth lives. Jung talked about the persona in the context of a larger process he called individuation, the lifelong movement toward becoming more fully and authentically yourself. Not a fixed destination, not a state you arrive at, but a direction of travel. Once you know it's there, once you can feel the difference between the mask and the face beneath it, you can begin to use it more consciously. To choose with more awareness what you show and what you protect, to wear it lightly rather than desperately. And something shifts in how you relate to other people too. When you understand that everyone you encounter is also wearing a mask, the polished, confident, seemingly untroubled people around you are also managing a gap. The world becomes slightly less intimidating and slightly more human. You stop measuring your inside against their outside. You stop assuming that the version of themselves they've chosen to present is the whole of who they are. Because it never is for any of us. Here's the paradox worth sitting with. The mask is real, the face beneath it is also real. And most of us spend our lives trying to make the two feel like the same thing, trying to close the gap, to believe that who we perform ourselves to be is who we actually are. But maybe the gap isn't the problem, maybe the gap is just information. Evidence that you're larger than any single presentation of yourself, that you contain more than any room has ever been allowed to see. The question isn't whether you're wearing a mask, you are, we all are. The question is whether you know you're wearing it. If this made you think, there's more where that came from. The question isn't whether this is happening to you, the question is whether you're willing to look.
If something in this video stirred something in you, that's worth paying attention to. The Psychology Shadow explores one idea at a time, slowly and carefully. Subscribe if you want to keep looking. And if this made you think, drop it in the comments. I read every one.